So, power balancing realists argue that their perspective is the one that's most informed by history, in that historically, countries or powers that have been unipolar in nature, where they've been what we would call the hegemon or the leader of the pack, that operated in a system where there was no major rival or other rivals fairly even in power, that those countries have been subject to decay. Those countries have also been subject to collapse from external conquest. But what they do, it's like they're almost like a bug zapper light in a yard in the summertime where the bugs fly into the light. What you have is maybe you have lots and lots of bugs, and eventually you have so many bugs that it burns out the circuit, and it no longer functions. And so one of the fears of power balancing realists is that while a unipolar system might at one hand seem advantageous to the United States because it has the most power, collectively it also means that it becomes a target, not a power that is seen as beneficial or cooperative, and that really all unipolarity does is make the United States a big target for all sorts of rivalries, which means other countries will try to compete with it in terms of material capabilities or even work together to bring down that unipolar power, that hegemon. So they believe that power balancing ultimately leads away from war and provides stability. And so that means that one power may not control all of the power or be the central actor, but the upside is that because of shared burdens and interests, these powers often work together to resolve problems, so that ultimately it leads away from war and provides stability in the world system. So it also means that if sometimes it means you sponsor or work with a power that may be a rival of yours, you do share some interests. So sharing power or balancing those powers, making sure that no one power is so far built up that it feels that it can target other powers. This, to power balancing realists, that causes war. Some power balancers would also argue, as we'll talk about, that the idea of preemptive war, which is advocated by power transition realists, that preemptive war, as it's currently understood, is actually the result of power imbalance and imperial hubris. So I'll talk about that in a moment. But the important thing to understand here is that being the lone power is also can be dangerous, and it's also important to a power balancing realist that power is used judiciously and wisely, because international prestige is also important. So a lack of international respect from other countries, even though they may not outstrip you in power, but being known as a responsible and reliable member of the international community also helps in balancing power and reducing the concept of anarchy in the world system. So if you're a reliable, rational actor, and you have other reliable, rational actors that you can deal with who are fairly even to you in power, and so you have multiple very powerful countries, they all stand to lose a great deal with greater anarchy in the system, with perhaps greater conflict, or other new state threats. So what happens is you have a number of countries who share some of these interests, even if they might be competitors in the market or some other ways, that they're secured. To them, security is actually improved by sharing some of these key interests. One way of looking at it. So a diagram that might help explain this, and in the case of the Soviet Union collapsing. So when the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of the Cold War, the question was, well, the Soviet Union has this large stockpile of nuclear missiles and nuclear weapons and chemical weapons and biological weapons, and it used to be a united group of republics, and now it's separate. And if this Russian government doesn't pan out and they have control over this nuclear arsenal, what happens to the nuclear arsenal? Is Russia desperate enough to sell it in exchange for financial assistance of some kind from perhaps a rogue state? Or is it powerful enough to protect them from theft by warlords of some kind? So this is a very real security concern for the United States in the early 1990s. One of the things that a power balancing realist would see here is that if we see the Soviet Union represented by this block, and it's filled in, meaning that the Soviet Union here may have been a rival to the United States, it may have been another superpower, but it also had a great deal of self-interest and a number of things to lose through conflict. So the United States understood that government, and so when that collapsed and a number of its republics became independent states, what happened is that now the United States has to deal with 12 independent states. I know there's only 9 blocks. I couldn't fit 12. But the idea is that the United States now has to deal with 12 different independent states that may or may not be run by friendly governments. Now, if the United States encouraged the further collapse of the Soviet Union to a power balancing realist, this would invite great catastrophe, because in the American mindset, or at least in the power balancing realist mindset, that means that its nuclear arsenal, its weapons of mass destruction, as well as a number of its people, its finances, would all be put into play. And that one regime that we knew that the United States did not like, but could understand in the sense of enacting in certain rational senses, was now gone and therefore empty. So power has been, we could say it's vacuumed out. So it's like you took a vacuum cleaner and you sucked out the color and you separated it into 9 pieces, and you sucked out the color from each one. So you now have independent states that may be small. They may have access to nuclear and chemical and biological weapons and other important resources. And now you may have some people encouraging the rise of new governments, which may be very hostile to American interests, and also with little to lose, so maybe more inclined to use these kinds of weapons or sponsor asymmetric warfare against the United States as a way of attacking American hegemony. All sorts of problems here. So the United States argued that in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the United States as well as Europe needed to provide funding, aid, to help the new Russian government and these new governments in the socialist republics succeed. Finding that having some sort of stable system meant that you preserve the possibility of anarchy and the potential for one of these states becoming what we call a rogue state. It's a lot, I understand. So we have the victory of the power balancing realist happens right at the end of the Cold War. So President George Herbert Walker Bush, who was president from 1989 to 1993, is won over by power balancing realists. And what does this mean? During his administration, George H.W. Bush will support aid to the former Soviet Union, encouraging established figures who take over in these new governments, and even arguing, as you saw in your textbook, that the United States was not just going to back new regimes for the sake of backing new regimes, that they had to act or uphold certain standards. And so the United States In this case, you see power balancing realists looking to balance power in the region and find what they consider to be stable actors to deal with so that the United States has a way of reliably assuring security and the balance of power in that region to make it less threatening to any possible American interests. At the same time, you see increased trade with China as a way of helping to also build China, cooperate with China, but also balance power. So China is powerful. Part of the reason it's more so is because of the value of its trade. But to the United States, in a number of respects, a powerful China is also in the best interest of the United States. After Saddam Hussein's invasion of the country of Kuwait, George Bush assembled a multilateral group, so meaning many countries to work together through a United Nations resolution, relying on the idea of collective security, which we most often associate with sort of the liberal perspective. But in this case, we can see with power balancing realism that this multilateral action is also very much in line with power balancing realism, in that this multilateral coalition meant to be a judicious use of American power. While the United States was the centerpiece of this UN force, you had other members of NATO and the United Nations providing troops to help. And because of this, the United States didn't look as if it was an invading force, and it waited for Saddam Hussein to do something before stepping over the line into action. So action is response, not preemption, meaning attacking something before it happens. So, in fact, we'll see a lot of power balancing realists will ultimately reject the idea of unilateral action, meaning acting alone, and prefer to assemble multilateral coalitions. So that would be the description of power balancing realism. So what does this mean to have power transition realism? So if this wins out in the Bush administration, and we'll see a liberal interlude during the Clinton years, George Herbert Walker Bush's son, G.W. Bush, who assumed the presidency in January 2001, was on the job exactly 9 months, roughly. Well, not exactly, roughly 9 months, when two terrorist attacks, planes crashed into the World Trade Center, and another plane crashed into the Pentagon. So the 9/11 terrorist attacks also saw that the people that George W. Bush had in office as his foreign policy advisors, his international relations advisors, actually argued in favor of unipolarity. So they argued, their belief was that, yes, they're realists, but they think that unipolarity, so the United States as hegemon, or U.S. hegemony, is actually beneficial to the United States. And the United States must preserve this at all costs. That unipolarity allows the United States to best secure its interests, and that any vulnerabilities that the United States is left open to by being the big, say, donut in the center, ready to be picked at by smaller powers, the United States must counter that vulnerability to things like asymmetric warfare, rogue and failed states, or other threats by the use of preemptive war. Now, this was a policy encouraged by a young member of the previous Bush administration during the Gulf War, Dick Cheney, who had worked for G.W. Bush's father as well, and wrote a memo arguing in favor of what we call unilateral action, and that the United States has the right to defend its interest in unilateral action. And this didn't really win the heart of President George Herbert Walker Bush in the early 90s. In fact, that President Bush was a power balancing realist, so he didn't find this compelling. this memo that Cheney and team drafted at that time got recycled, and right after 9/11, this memo became enacted as official U.S. policy, and so now American policy argued that unilateral warfare or preemptive warfare, in this case specifically, was now legal and appropriate to use, as the United States had to defend itself against terrorism. It also either declared that countries were either with the United States, and if they weren't with the United States, meaning doing what the United States asked and following its counterterrorism policies, then these countries were enemies of the United States and were therefore dangerous and needed to be addressed. So the problem that you'll see is that the power transition realists, to them, they think that this moment is a break from traditional history. And so that the United States isn't governed by, say, the rules of the past or past cycles, but rather we're making new history, and just because previous empires didn't maintain their unilateral power or their hegemony, that the United States can't. And so power transition realists argue that this transition of power from a bipolar system to a unipolar system is something the United States must grab onto, needs to hold. This group becomes more influential in American international relations after the terrorist attacks on 9/11. And it's there that Cheney's old memo from the early 90s is recycled about 10 years later and becomes American, your U.S. policy. The United States declares that preemptive attack, what the United States sees as preemptive attack, is legitimate. So the United States can now go to war on the fear or the assumption that a state might be preparing to do damage to the United States or sponsors terrorism or that hosts rogue states. And so that's the realist school that has taken over since. And so what we see is this debate between both sides, which is very interesting, and I think one of the things we have to really square away with as we investigate further realism.